Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Victor Davella. I am the departmental lecturer in Sanskrit at the Oriental Institute in the University of Oxford. And today I will be giving you a presentation entitled Sanskrit and the Expansion of Indian Culture Across the Globe. Before we get started, however, I would like to begin in the way that many important lessons and ceremonies begin in India, and that is with a short verse in dedication to a particular deity, in this case, Rama. So this is known as a namaskara. Aparam apahartaram dataram sarvasampadam lokabhiramam shriramam bhuyo bhuyo namamyaham. I bow down again and again to Lord Rama, the delight of the earth, who removes all calamities and who gives to us every success. So with that, we can get started with the actual talk, and I will begin by sharing my screen. So this is, this is our title, Sanskrit and the Expansion of Indian Culture Across the Globe. In the background, you will see a picture of a lake in Srinagar, the capital of Kashmir. Before we really dive into the talk itself, I think it's important that we have a brief look, at least, at a map of India and where it is located on the globe, and what a few of the basic features are, and a few basic facts about India in the modern day, many of which are also true for the past several hundred, if not thousands of years. So we can have a simple look at India on a Google Maps image. If we zoom out a bit, we can see India and its relation to the continents of Asia, to Africa, and to Europe. As you know, we are located here in the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom, of course, has played a very important, for various reasons, both good and bad, a very important role in the history of modern India, that is for the past 200, 300 years. And it's worth noting the great distance between England and India, and the difficulties that would be involved in reaching India from the United Kingdom. If we zoom in a bit more on India, we can point out a few topographical features. One, India is surrounded to the south, that is on both the west and the east, by water, by the Arabian Sea, and by the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean to the south, with nearby Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka almost can be seen from the tip, from the southern part of India. To the north, however, India is sort of locked in by the largest mountain range in the world, the Himalaya mountains, where we have things such as Mount Everest and the like. This makes it very difficult both to get into India as well as to get out of India. If you want to come in by land, you have to cross great deserts. You have to make your way over the mountains, and this is only possible by moving through narrow passes. So one of the most famous of these is the Khyber Pass, which was used throughout history, and especially during the Silk Road. But there was enough reason to come to India that people willingly made the trek from China, even from Rome. We have evidence of trade. And of course, in more recent times, the French, the British, and other European powers went to great lengths to trade and to, in the case of the British, to take over and colonize India. Another fact that's worth pointing out is the very lush jungle looking landscape. It's not quite as lush as it was in the past, but India's a tropical climate, and it is one that is fed by the yearly monsoon. So all food depends basically on the fall of the yearly rains. And if they do not fall, if there is a drought, then there will inevitably, at least in the past, end up being hardship, if not famine. We might also point out in terms of modern India, that although it is one country, so it's certainly one unit, political unit, it is actually made up of several different regions. And whether you're in the north or you're in the south, there can be rather vast differences in terms of customs, in terms of language. So there are over 477 sort of documented languages in India, although the number of official languages is far fewer. Nevertheless, it's important to keep in mind that when we speak of India, we're speaking of a great diversity in both customs, language, and as well as religion. So India is mostly, as you know, probably Hindu, but there are substantial Muslim populations, there are small Jewish populations and Christian populations. And these are not only modern as a result of modern proselytizers, but there are very old Christian traditions in India as well that possibly date back to St. Thomas the Apostle. And these are on the southern coast, and they practice the Syriac rite, not sort of Catholicism or Protestantism or Lutheranism. So India is today, and always has been, an incredibly diverse place with a wide range of peoples, religions, and practices. And I would also mention that although we have sort of these political boundaries currently, when we talk about India historically, we often are referring to a slightly larger area that would include modern day Pakistan and modern day Bangladesh, which used to be called East Pakistan, actually. And also under the British, we would perhaps also include Myanmar or Burma. So that's to give you a basic idea of what India looks like, how it's situated geographically and in terms of its topography, and what kind of impact that has on the country and how people interacted with it. So we can return now with that in mind to the slideshow. So our first slide and our first sort of topic will be yoga. So this is probably one of the things that you will associate most with India, as something that has come out of India, as something that has sort of impacted many of our lives, and something that is widely practiced throughout the world. So in this image, I think is something is perhaps very typical. We have some sort of studio, we have people wearing athletic clothing that are looking healthy and striking a particular posture, an asana. This yoga is usually associated with some sort of meditative practices. So you can maybe at the end, you sit and you meditate and you think or you relax. It's become a huge $1 billion a year, upwards of $6 billion are spent on yoga lessons and traveling to do yoga and things like that. And it arose really during the 20th century, especially since the 1990s. The question, however, that we should ask ourselves when we come to university and when we study are what are the actual origins of this, and what would a knowledge of Sanskrit allow us to find out about such modern popular phenomena? Well, there's actually quite a lot that we could learn about yoga if we sort of look at the sources that we have, the documentation of yoga in the past. And we would find that there is actually a huge difference. The scene that we saw on the last slide, this is something completely foreign to India of 100 years ago, or even maybe 80 years ago. And it's completely foreign for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about now. So yoga in the past was not something that was quite so really oriented to these postures, to these asanas, okay, things like downward dog or whatever. It was a practice that was taken up by various people at various times and with different goals, but ultimately sort of with a goal of spiritual liberation, of moksha. This is primarily for men, and sort of the typical yogis that we think of were ones who were actually considered to be polluting for higher castes. So they were sort of on the outskirts of society. They had these rather extreme practices. They were considered, holy men who were working toward a specific goal of liberation, but they did so sort of outside of society, and they were to a certain degree venerated, as you can see in the image I have given you here. And there certainly were postures recorded early on, but these postures were nothing like the sort of athletic strength training poses that we know today. These were often simply postures that you would hold for long periods of time, and that would help you as a form of devotion to God, as a form of torturing the body, and this sort of torturing the body was an important aspect of many practices that would lead you to develop powers to break the cycle of birth and death, which is sort of ultimately the goal. So you can see here the man holding up his arms, which he would do, for years on end, something like that. It's also coupled with a long philosophical tradition dating back to texts like the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And these were primarily written in Sanskrit. There's been a lot of research recently on this that really illuminates how yoga started and how it developed. And it turns out that actually in the late 19th and early 20th century, up until the 20s and 30s, the sort of asanas and postures that we associate most with modern yoga were shunned, both by Indian writers, Anglophone Indian writers like Vivekananda. He wrote a book called Raja Yoga in 1896. And various other travelers in India and scholars in India saw yogis as really people that were not doing things that should be imitated. They were sort of people that you would find on the street, or people that would were not, yes, you would not invite them to teach you a class. They viewed them with moral and judicial censure and disgust, morbid fascinations. They were more of these sort of contortions of the body were more viewed as things, as spectacles. Nevertheless, in the sort of in this period of from the early 20th century leading up into the 30s and 40s, people began to translate different Sanskrit texts that made a more scientific medical argument for these postures being used in meditation and in sort of spiritual practices. However, the real impetus to get to where we are today with modern yoga has come from an interest in European and American discussions of health and general physical fitness, especially from Scandinavian systems of exercise, methods that were employed, for example, by the YMCA for the training of men, things like calisthenics. This actually fed much more into the development of modern yoga practice than perhaps what we would have expected if we had not looked sort of at Sanskrit texts, if we had not delved deeper into the question. So that's sort of yoga in the past and kind of how it develops into the yoga of today. So it's quite an interesting story for which there is an ever-growing body of literature. The next one that we could look at that is very, I think, familiar to most people is Indian food in the modern world. So, bhojanam. So we generally know, perhaps we have some image like this in mind. We have various dishes. We have naan, we have rice, we have some kind of maybe chicken tikka, we have some masala. And all of these would be served, often we get it in a restaurant, or you can make it yourself. It is, however, mostly what we think is sort of typical derives from North Indian cuisine that had been heavily influenced by the Mughals. Indian food that then came slowly into Europe, into America and other places across the world as people immigrated from India to the various places across the globe. Indian food in the past, though. So what do we know actually about Indian food leading up to the modern day? Well, we actually know quite a lot. And one of our main resources for knowing this are a number of Sanskrit texts that we have dating from perhaps about the middle, or from about the turn into the common second millennium of the Common Era. We know that there was, both in modern day and in the past, that there was great regional variety with a strong north-south divide. This usually concerns whether one consumes rice or bread. So the north is generally has this naan, and it's more bread-oriented for your sort of starch food, whereas in the south, they are very much rice-oriented. And they will have rice to the exclusion of bread. Indian food in India, at least in some places, is still eaten in the south, where I have spent most of my time, can still be eaten, as you see in the image, on a banana leaf, so a large leaf that is cleaned with water, and then you put all of the food in here, sometimes with and without these little silver dishes. And then you mix it all together bit by bit into the rice and eat it usually with your hand. However, a lot of the things that we think of as being sort of typical Indian food derive from the New World, that is from South America in particular. This is, of course, very true of food in Europe as well. So if we think of Italian food, we would think, of course, of pasta sauce being made from tomatoes, but tomatoes, of course, are something that only arrived after Europeans had gone to the New World, to the Americas, and had brought back tomatoes. Also things like potatoes, and even, and it's quite astonishing, the chili pepper, which is so common and ubiquitous in Indian cuisine, would also have derived ultimately from the New World. And this happened through a lot of the interactions with the Portuguese in the beginning. So the Portuguese traded in particular, even modern day, you might know of Goa as being particularly a place that was once ruled by the Portuguese. This is on the west coast, about the midway between north and south. So a lot of this came in quite recently, so within the past 400, 300 years. But we're able to sort of go back and see recipes for Indian food, how they existed before all of this influence, thanks to a number of sources that we have written in primarily in Sanskrit, although also in some of the other regional languages as well. Many of these are also tied into Ayurveda, into life science, and have to do with what kinds of food are healthy or not healthy, things like that. But we might also turn now to another question, how basically did all of this come to reach us? So how did things like yoga spread? How did things like Indian food spread? And as we'll see in a moment, how did other things concepts and ideas spread prior, even earlier on. But for these main ones, and for sort of our modern world, India reached us basically through a series of waves of missionaries that went to spread Christianity, and then through a series of trading companies. So already in the 17th century, and even earlier than that, the Portuguese and Italian missionaries, so Catholic ones, went along with people that would trade with the Mughal Empire. They ended up returning, and some of them ended up writing grammars. We'll talk about that in a moment. A bit later, these trading companies began to multiply. England had one, France had one, the Netherlands had one, and they were all going basically to try and get the right from the Mughal Empire, Mughal Emperor, to trade, to set up outposts, and to then bring back all of these highly desired, especially highly desired goods, especially clothing and spices, fabrics, and sell them and make a large profit. And so the British, they sort of saw what the Dutch were doing and became very interested as well and wanted to join in. So they created this East India Company at the beginning of the 17th century. They eventually ousted everyone else. So the French were very important players for some time, as well as the Dutch, but the British, as we now know, they ended up taking over much of India, and this was at a very important, happened basically at a very important moment, a battle of 1757 called the Battle of Plassey. This man, Robert Clive, who's depicted in this picture here, received the Diwani rights from Emperor Shah Alam. So this basically gave the British the East India Company. So remember, this is not actually the crown. This isn't the state or anything. This is a private company. The right to not only trade, but also to administer justice and basically run a huge swath of land in India. And in particular, this was the area in the northeast in modern day Calcutta. They eventually, of course, they also had places in the south, Madras, what was formerly Madras, now Chennai, and then, of course, in the west, what was Bombay, now Mumbai. So all of these major cities, basically, of India today on the coast, they were developed by the British as trading posts and sort of places for them to have their headquarters or their armies and so forth. So Robert Clive, whom you can sort of see statues of around London and other places, he got this right, and he brought back a tremendous amount of wealth to England and really started them on the path of taking over much of the rest of India. This continued with the East India Company until 1857, 1858, where there was, it goes by various names. It's called sometimes the Sepoy Mutiny, the rebellion. Perhaps more properly, it should be called the First War of Independence of India. So this is when soldiers and other people rebelled against Indian rule, the rule within India, and it was a very bloody, horrific war that lasted about a year. And the British eventually crushed the rebellion, and they abolished the East India Company and took over, the crown took over the Indian possessions, and they created what it was known as the British Raj. So when Victoria is Empress of India, prior to that, they were not technically part of the crown, so we don't have any emperors or empresses of India prior to this time, but after that, then they are also styled the Empress, Emperor of India. So this is one of the most important ways that Indian civilization and culture and ideas started to come into Europe was under the British, under the rule of the East India Company and then under the British Raj. So, along with this came, of course, the study of India. So the study of Indian languages emerged, as I mentioned before, with these missionaries, usually Jesuits. Jesuits, as you perhaps may know, were the very learned, most learned, perhaps one of the most learned branches of the Catholic Church. And they came back to Europe and wrote grammars of Sanskrit, for example. Also other Indian languages. We have early Portuguese, dictionary of Tamil, a South Indian language, a Dravidian language. As the British sort of progressed and settled in Calcutta and the other, and Madras and in Bombay, they began to found these Royal Asiatic Societies. So the Royal Asiatic Society of Bengal was founded in 1784. Language was very important, not only for scholarship, so people translating texts, looking at new languages, documenting new languages, sending back translations that would then be taken up across Europe. So a lot of the early translations of the Bhagavad Gita or Kalidasa's Shakuntala, these became immensely popular and were translated then into other European languages, and it impacted people like Goethe and other thinkers, philosophy as well throughout Europe. So, but it wasn't only the scholarship that was really important for the British, but it was important that they understood the language, local languages, so that they could rule and they could administer justice, so that they could resolve legal disputes, land disputes, things like this. And this was one of the initial factors that people were learning languages like Sanskrit. And also, it might come as a surprise, but it was also very important to know Persian and to know Arabic, because Persian really was the main administrative language of India and under the Mughals, and even in the south, where Mughal dominance was not so strong. Persian was used throughout. So when people went to India, they learned, were first kind of learning Persian, Arabic, and then Sanskrit, and then maybe Bengali regional languages. So the man that I've given you an image of here is Sir William Jones. He was one of the founders of the Royal Asiatic Society of Bengal. And he studied sort of Persian and Arabic, and then got quite fascinated with Sanskrit and did quite a lot of work and translation. Died, however, as you can see, relatively young, but nevertheless left a large impact on the imagination, at least, as well as his scholarship. And he went originally to be a judge, to work in the law courts, and that was his main interest at first. This then allowed for several things to happen. So as they set up these institutions, these colleges in India, these forts in India, this then began the long and some degree even ongoing process of manuscripts leaving India and coming to Europe. So if you go to major capitals, especially London, Paris, to a lesser degree Rome, and also at some libraries in Germany, you will find large quantities of Sanskrit manuscripts and manuscripts of other Indian languages. And as a result of this allowed Sanskrit to be taught in Europe. So there were finally the sort of people sort of knew of Sanskrit for quite some time, and there were sort of shady ideas of what Sanskrit was. But once these sort of manuscripts and grammars that were being produced reached Europe, then they were able to take up a serious study of the language. And so Sanskrit was then taught at various places by the end of the 19th century. It was taught throughout Germany, it was taught in France, and it of course was taught in the UK. So here at Oxford, we have, I believe now, the only professorship of Sanskrit in the United Kingdom. And that is the Bowdoin Professorship, which was started in 1832 with money bequeathed to the university by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Bowdoin. His goal in doing this was slightly different than much different than what we want to do today. His goal was, as with many other people who studied these languages, he wanted to try to convert people to Christianity. So he wanted Sanskrit to be studied so that they could convert sort of the Brahmins, the priests of the society, who would then convert everybody else. So although this is no longer part of the Bowdoin goals of the Bowdoin professor, or even in the Bowdoin professorship description, this is the origin of Sanskrit studies. In Oxford, at least, there are other places that Sanskrit was studied as well. There eventually became to be a Regis professorship in Edinburgh, which is no longer occupied. And in Cambridge, there was also once professorship. And it was also taught at a place called the East India Company College, which is now a boarding school called the Haileybury Imperial Service College. And at this place, they taught Indian languages, basically training people who would go to India so that they would have to work for the company, the East India Company, and so that they would have knowledge of the languages before they actually arrived in India. So we see the spread of Sanskrit in the academic world, throughout England, throughout Europe, and of course also in the United States and other places as well. So Sir William Jones is an interesting person, especially within Oxford and Calcutta, because we have, well, he died in India of an illness, and this white sort of pyramid obelisk looking thing is his grave. And he was also memorialized in Oxford in, well, at least two places that I know of. One is a memorial in University College, UNIV, and we have a depiction of him here sitting with Indian learned men, pundits, studying Sanskrit or studying Persian or studying Arabic. And it's an interesting depiction that has often been criticized for sort of its, well, yes, imperial way that he is sort of seated above his Indian counterparts. But we have these still in Oxford, and it's a part of our of the history of Sanskrit studies here. The other one, this is in the University Church of St. Mary. This one's maybe a bit funny. So this is his, you know, it describes him. This is all in Latin, that's William Jones. But the man, I don't know if this is really meant to be him, but he's sort of dressed maybe in almost like a toga or something, and he's holding a book. And on the book, it's the name of one of the lawgivers of the Sanskrit tradition named Manu, and it's written in the Devanagari script, but it's actually upside down. So it seems that when they went to carve it, somebody wrote out the word, but then when they put it on the book, the carver didn't know which way Devanagari should go. So we ended up with that. So there are actually quite a number of things around Oxford, as we'll see in a moment, that have to do with India and the spread of sort of Sanskrit and Indian literature and culture into the UK. And so it's worth taking one moment at least to think a little bit about India's place in the empire. This is a map that was made, I believe, around 1940. Actually, it's in a German book. And it's one that shows, I think, quite well why India was so central to the British Empire. It was so central for two reasons. One, it produced an enormous amount of money. It was an unbelievably rich, produced more than any place than Australia or any place else. It was just the crown jewel. And it was enormously important in terms of the development of the rest of the empire, because much of the rest of the empire was in one way or another related to either getting to India or keeping India. So there, of course, was additional expansion. But if we look kind of at the routes that we have, you can see these trade routes, these lines radiating out of England. To get around Africa, they had to have places like the Cape of Good Hope to stop and sort of refuel. They had to hold onto the Suez Canal. So the Suez Canal was built to enhance to speed up the journey to India. Then the surrounding area of Egypt and down Africa, all of these sort of ended up being tied in one way or another to preserving this route, this trade route to India. So it's hard to understate India's role in the developments of the British Empire. And as you can see, many of the places that were impacted, especially in the Middle East, the reason that one of the reasons we have the geopolitical map that we have today was as a result of the British and also other European powers sort of interfering and trying to keep their foothold in this region. And this sort of idea of India's centrality to the empire is summed up quite nicely by Lord Curzon of Kettleston in a address that he gave at the Philosophical Institute of Edinburgh in 1909. So Lord Curzon was Viceroy or General Governor of India at the end of the 19th century, so from 1899 to 1905. And he says in this address, and we'll just read maybe a brief excerpt from this because it's quite interesting. He says, "Consider in the first place what a part India has played in the shaping of British policy and the expansion of the British Dominion. It has been the determining influence in every considerable movement of British power to the east and south of the Mediterranean. The Eastern question of the Middle Ages was merely the recovery of the holy places from infidel hands. But once we had planted ourselves in India, the Eastern question, though it revolved around Constantinople, was in reality directed by considerations of the security of our Indian possessions. But for India, Lord Beaconsfield would not have bought the shares in the Suez Canal. And but for the Suez Canal, we should not now be in Egypt. The historic rivalry and struggles with Russia for nearly a century sprang from the supposed necessity of keeping her far away from the frontiers of India. Had it not been for India, we should never have seized the Cape or begun that career of South African expansion that has lately entered upon so remarkable and pregnant a phase." Here he's referring, so we're past the Anglo-Boer Wars, the second one, and this is leading up to the creation of the Union of South Africa and the ultimate incorporation into the empire. To return. But for India, we should not have been able to incarcerate the mighty spirit of Napoleon in the rocky prison of St. Helena. Mauritius would not now be ours, nor should we have acquired a predominant position in Mesopotamia or have controlled the Persian Gulf. India compelled us to lay hold of Aden, a position of incomparable importance, and to establish a protectorate over the neighboring parts of Arabia. India started us on that career of territorial conquest, which is only arrested by the snowy ramparts of the Himalayas, and which converted us from a small island with trading and maritime interest into the grandest land power of the world. It was through India that we established those connections with the Straits settlements formerly under the rule of the Governor General of India, and with China and Japan that were the foundation of our once unchallenged and still powerful position in the Far East. So this really gives you an idea of how India was perceived during the empire and the incredibly important role that it had in determining so many of the political decisions. To come back to sort of more, I guess, academic topics, there was an attempt within Oxford at least, to establish greater ties, academic ties, to India through the founding of the Indian Institute. So this is a building that still stands today. It is no longer the Indian Institute, but we'll see some modern pictures in a moment. And it was sort of the idea of the second Bowdoin professor, Sir Manuel Williams. And in 1883, well, they had acquired the land. This is at the end of Broad Street. They had acquired the land and they wanted to build a new building for this institute. And in 1883, the Prince of Wales laid the foundation stone. It was intended to help foster relations, study of India with Indians who would come to Oxford to study. And to that end, they had a museum and a library. And this would eventually evolve into, or at least be absorbed into, what is now the Oriental Institute at Oxford. It was never particularly successful, unfortunately. There were some Indians that came, but never quite as many as they had envisioned. And it was sort of always in struggling financially. And it eventually would be closed down after the Second World War and independence of India. It continued on a downward slope and has long since been defunct. But the building remained and the library remained, and the Indian Institute Library remained a separate library in Oxford until fairly recently and has now been absorbed into the Bodleian as well. Today you can still see sort of remnants of it. So there's sort of, there must perhaps once have been golden or brass fittings in here or something, but you can still sort of see the ghostly remnants of the name Indian Institute on the building, which is now the Oxford Martin School. There are various carvings on the building, so you have elephants on the outside that you can see. And on top of it, there still remains this wonderful weather vane of an elephant, which you can make out from the grounds. But this really helped to sort of, along with the manuscript collection that would come to Oxford, this helped to develop the study of Sanskrit and to spread the academic and to a lesser degree, sort of, I guess, spiritual side of Indian culture to the UK. But it has had a lasting impact and is, of course, still ongoing to this very day, although the Indian Institute itself is no longer here. But the actual history of India and the expansion of Indian ideas, Indian religion, Indian culture, Indian languages outside of India far predates anything that the British did or any Europeans. The spread of Indian religion, especially Buddhism, happened on its own and happened quite early on. So India's perhaps greatest impact, if we think about all of history, is the spread of Buddhism. So Buddhism originated in India by the Buddha in about the middle of the first millennium BCE. However, it developed a large number of texts that were written in a language related to Sanskrit called Pali. It was a religion that people wanted to spread. So there were sort of active attempts to spread the philosophy of the Buddha. And this was quite successful. It went down to Sri Lanka, it spread across India. And then it started spreading up to the north west to this, where Pakistan is now, into Central Asia along the Silk Road, and of course into China. And we know that there are relatively early translations of Sanskrit Buddhist texts into Chinese. So I give you here an example of a Chinese translation of the Heart Sutra, the Prajna Paramita Hridaya in Sanskrit. But many of these texts were then either translated from Sanskrit or from some Middle Indic that is a descendant from Sanskrit into any number of languages along the Silk Road, such as Tocharian, Old Uyghur, Tibetan a bit later on. And from China, of course, it spread to Korea and Japan eventually. Similarly, and these were mainly Sanskrit texts or a northern version of Buddhism. The Pali version of Buddhism spread, as I said, to Sri Lanka, and then from Sri Lanka it went to Southeast Asia. But all of this was kind of happening well within sort of either just before the beginning of the Common Era or during the Common Era, and continued into Tibetan up till basically the end of Buddhism. It's also important to remember that Buddhism itself died out of India. So by the 13th, 14th century, Buddhism was completely gone from India, despite it having thrived there for so long. And another part of that way that it expanded was that there were a number of pilgrims who came from China in particular to India to study Sanskrit, to study Buddhism, to travel around. So we have, to just name one example, we have a Buddhist monk, Xuanzang of the 7th century Tang dynasty, who came through this Khyber Pass that I had mentioned before, into the Swat Valley and into Kashmir. And he basically crisscrossed India. So he spent time in the north west, and he made it across basically kind of the Doab or the Ganges and things like that, into a famous university known as Nalanda in modern Bihar, so not quite as far east as Bengal, but just before there. And when he returned back to China, he then wrote down a travel journal, much as we see today, called Journey to the West, because from China he would have had headed to the West. So this really attests to how Buddhism spread and the appeal that India had for foreigners to come. Not only, as I said, there was of course great profit in trading with India that had gone on with Rome from a very early period in the Common Era, but there was great interest in the academic, almost tourism, but also very academic and religious study in India. Another area that, so I think it's maybe somewhat well known that Buddhism spread to China, into Tibet, into Japan, and like this. But it's perhaps not as well known or popularly known that the Brahmanical religions, so these religions where you worshipped Vishnu or where you worshipped Shiva, sort of the more popular Hinduism with the epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, and Sanskrit literature in general, spread to Southeast Asia. So we can maybe look briefly once again at a map to make sure we understand. So this would have been coming through from China, coming in through the Silk Road. We would have come down along here. Nalanda University would have been in Bihar, in this region. And then Southeast Asia would be this region over here. So we will actually see a few images and talk a little bit about Cambodia in particular, in part because I had the great privilege of being able to visit Siem Reap and Angkor Wat in the last couple of years. But it's perhaps not as well known that a lot of aspects of Indian culture spread in particular from South India into this region of the world. So it is now Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, and also down into Indonesia and to Jakarta, and as far off as Borneo. So we'll look at a few examples of what it meant for Indian religion and Indian culture to spread over to this part of the world. And this began in the middle of the, in the first half of the first millennium CE, so maybe 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. And with it, they exported not only aspects of the religion, but they exported with it the way that they expressed their power. So the way that kings would sort of present themselves in Cambodia, in Southeast Asia, was very much an imitation of the ways that a Hindu king would express himself. And a lot of this manifested in architecture, in the way that temples were built. It manifested in inscriptions. So we find incredibly beautiful poetic inscriptions throughout Southeast Asia in Sanskrit, in perfect, beautiful Sanskrit. And this was a result not of any real forceful campaign, but sort of as a result of the interaction of the two cultures and an interest in having these legitimizing features of the kingdom, and especially having the sort of Brahmin rites and solemnity that came along with that. Buddhism, of course, also came, and Buddhism would eventually dominate in Southeast Asia, especially in Thailand and Burma, but that's a bit later. So to say a word about this image here, this is there are a lot of kind of railings in Cambodian temples and other places, and these railings will end, they'll terminate in looks like a giant snake, and this is indeed a giant snake. And this is named Vasuki, and he is a snake that sometimes sits around Shiva's shoulders. He was also used, and this is how I think the main reason it's there in Cambodia, it was used in a story of when the gods, they had to mix the ocean to make the nectar of immortality. So they mixed a ocean of milk with a giant mountain, and they wrapped the snake around it, and they pulled on each end the gods and the demons. And they used this snake, Vasuki, to kind of twirl around the mountain. And he therefore became really beloved in Southeast Asia, this image, especially the story. And that's why we find him on the end of all of these railings. You can actually find a depiction, a large sculpture of this in the Bangkok airport. So to give a few more examples, this is a sort of a Sanskrit, a very nice, wonderfully carved Sanskrit inscription that you would find on the side of a temple wall, for example. This is from a temple in Angkor, so maybe in near modern day Siem Reap. Angkor Wat is a large temple and temple complex. And Angkor was kind of the capital of the Khmer kingdom, which took over from about the 9th century and lasted till about the 15th century. And all of their kings had very Sanskritic names. So the one that we are talking about here, this is image is from the Bahuan temple in Angkor. This was built in the mid 11th century as the state temple of Udayaditya Varman. So these are very Sanskritic names. It was dedicated to Shiva. And on it we find all of the surfaces on this temple are intricately carved with scenes from Hindu myths. And here we have a series of scenes from a great Sanskrit poem known as the Kumara Sambhava by Kalidasa. So this is the love god Kamadeva, and then he's killed and is by Shiva, and his wife incinerated by Shiva, and then his wife Rati is mourning him, and then we have Parvati, Shiva's wife, she has to perform she has to be an ascetic. She has to be a female yogi, a yogini. So you can see her sort of practicing this yogic pose here to impress sages and Shiva. And then we have sort of scenes from the wedding of when Shiva and Parvati get married. So these are likely inspired by Kalidasa's work, which means that Sanskrit literature was studied in these far off places. And similarly, we have an example of the Bantai Samre temple complex in Angkor. We don't know exactly who perhaps the deities were, but there are endless depictions from the Ramayana of the story of Rama, who mentioned at the beginning, his brother Lakshmana, Ravana, the demon that he slays. Vishnu is depicted. And so you have these very complex, temples that they have with completely infused with Hindu mythology and scenes from the Indian epics. This one was built a bit later in the 12th century during the reigns of Suryavarman and Yashovarman II. The last thing that I would want to mention briefly in closing now is that there's actually yet another, something that we use every day, something that is very common, and this would be our numerals. So writing 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. We call these often Arabic numerals. So these are, as opposed to Roman numerals. Roman numerals we don't really use much anymore. Maybe we see them in an old book, or we see them in the date of a movie or something. But they're opposed to these Arabic numerals. But in fact, what are Arabic numerals originated in India. And I show you here sort of modern Devanagari version of these numerals compared with our own. And you can see that there are some striking similarities, but this decimal system originated, or this way of representing the decimal system originated in India and then spread through the Middle East and then to Europe. So although we call them Arabic numerals, we could and perhaps should at least remember that they are Indian in origin. And what's also very important about these is the representation of 0 as a placeholder. It's actually a very important concept that they had and that was not present in so many other systems. And we actually have one of the earliest manuscripts that has a 0 in the Bodleian library called the Bakshali manuscript. And it has a very early usage of 0 there. Well, I think that's about all we have time for today. So I hope that you were able to learn a little bit about aspects of Indian culture that were perhaps already familiar to you, such as yoga, such as Indian food, and how the study of Sanskrit in particular and a deeper study of India can reveal perhaps surprising things, and that you also were able to see the importance of India and India for at least the British and for the development of the modern political world, and that we perhaps saw a few things that were new relating to the spread of Indian civilization in the more distant past, in particular Buddhism, which, as I mentioned, surprisingly died out completely in India, but lived on elsewhere, and as well as the spread of more Hindu style religion and kingship representations in Southeast Asia. So thank you very much for listening, and have a good day. Bye-bye.